Hey guys, this is Miss Cat, and today we're going to be talking about how to create a movement script for our mushroom guy. So, as we left off last time, we kind of had set up the scene. We have a little floor for our guy to actually move around on. We have our mushroom guy, but as we said, we haven't put any movement on here, and so for that, we need to write a script. Now, before we get into this, you should have already gone over that scripting PowerPoint, watched the videos if you had time and stuff like that. Those really help you when it comes to scripting. All right, so first off, I got to open up my script by double clicking it, which brings it should open up Visual Studios or Mono Develop, whatever it is. It'll bring up something for you to actually script in. And so let's look at the first part of script again. So using system collections just means that we're in Unity, right? Collections generic Unity engine. So all that says is that we have certain words and certain phrases or whatever that it will recognize as just public in class that happen to be with the Unity project. All right, once again, my script is called player movement. We made that last time. And then I've got my two functions that it automatically comes with. So my void start, which is upon initialization, that means as soon as, that game object is instantiated, it's in the scene, this starts, and then void update, it is update are called once per frame. And as we know, games are called many seconds per frame because it has to feel realistic, right? Even if it's 2D game, if it's slow, you aren't going to want to play it. All right, so the first thing we need to do is we're going to make some variables, and you should, like I said before, you should have already watched those videos, so knowing how to make these variables should be pretty easy. I want to be able to, edit all of these variables in my inspector. So to do that, remember, we're going to make public variables, and once again, those have to be done in the class section. It cannot be under a function, or else I can't edit or actually use it in the different functions. So I'm going to make them up here. So I'm going to do public. And the first thing I want to do is remember how we put that rigid body on our mushroom? I want to be able to edit whose rigid body that is. So I need to make a rigid body 2D that I can actually edit and assign. So I'm going to call this rigid body, and it pulls down a drop menu. I can just click on rigid body 2D, press enter. I'm going to call this RB player. And once again, this just is the name of my rigid body. That way, as I call it throughout here, I'm not having to retype rigid body, 2D, whatever. I just type in RB player, and it knows exactly what I'm talking about. Next, I'm going to create two floats. Now remember, floats are those that allow us to have an integer with them. And the reason I like to use, or not an integer, sorry, a decimal point and stuff like that. The reason I like to use those is, if I don't like 5 and I don't like 4, I might like 4.5 and stuff like that when it comes to these things. So I just like to use floats because I feel like they're a little bit more than an integer. So public float, I'm going to call this speed equals 5. And the reason I'm using 5 is I found that's a really good number to use for this. It's not mandatory that you use a 5. You can put an F behind it because it is a float, right? But, 5 is the number I found. And the last one I'm going to make is I not only want my player to be able to go left and right, I want it to be able to jump. And so I need another variable to tell me how much I can jump. So I'm going to go public. Oh, let me respell that. Public float jump. And I call this jump thrust. So how high am I jumping? Or how much power is behind that jump? And I'm going to set this to 350 F. So once again, this is just because these are sweet numbers that I found that I enjoy with the type of style of play that I liked. I just thought those worked really well, and so that's what we're going to do. So we're not going to do anything under void start. We don't need to be touching it. It's not mandatory. It's all good. So instead, I'm going to go into void update, and let's talk about what we need to do here. So I want it to wherever I press a button, something happens. And so I cannot put that in my initialization or in my void start where it's initialized, right? Because it would only call it once. And so anything that I want to be called multiple times, I need to do in my void update because that'll keep checking to see if I've pressed a button. But before we actually go in and we start coding that, I want to make some more functions. Now, as we talked about before, you can create your own functions. This is where we're going to do it. So to create my own function, I'm going to do void. I'm going to call this move right, and then I have to do my parentheses and then my curly brackets. So remember my curvy brackets, or curly brackets, either one, what do you call it, hold all the information within a function. So I have to have this, and my function has to have the parentheses. So I'm going to do a move right. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to press void, move left, parentheses, and then my curvy brackets once again. Remember, syntax is really important whenever we're coding. So if you forget any of these things, it's going to break your code, and Unity is going to tell you to go back and find it. And the last one I'm going to make is I'm going to do move or void jump. I want to say jump up. Now, the other important thing is, once again, this has to do with syntax. Anytime I'm referring to any of these, I have a capitalization with my move and a capitalization with my left. They have to be exactly like this. Remember, I cannot have a space anywhere. Unity finds that weird, but I have to make sure my capitalizations are the same whenever I'm calling anything. Such as if my speed had a capital S, I would have to make sure that anytime I call it, it has a capital S. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start doing this. And so I'm going to go into my void update. And I'm going to add a few spaces in here because I always like to have extra space. That bothers me when I don't. And so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start coding in what my move right's going to do. And so this has to do with pressing a button and getting it to actually do something. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to type an if statement because we know it's if my button's being pressed. So I'm going to type if input. And what input does is it looks for something actually being inputted into the computer. So I'm going to press if input dot get key, which tells me I'm looking for a button that is being pressed. Get key, and then inside of get key, I'm going to say key code. I'm going to add another bracket. See, I added a bracket right here. Key code. And like I said, it needs to be capitalized. It's okay. It'll fix my code. Dot right. I can once again go down. I can either click, use the arrows, and then press enter. So right arrow. So what this basically says is if I press the right arrow and while I'm holding it down. So get key has to do with holding down the arrow. If input.get key, and this is how we're going to learn to call a function. So remember I talked about how you create your own. Well, unless you tell Unity how to call it, because our void start we know is on initialization and our update is called once per frame, well, our move and our jump aren't called at all unless we tell it to call them. So this is how we're going to call them, is we're going to say move, and we're on the right arrow, so move right. And once again, I just down arrowed until I found the right one. You can always just type it out too. But this makes sure that I have the exact same spelling, the exact same capitalization. And I'm going to add my parentheses and a semicolon. Remember, if it's not an if statement, a function, or a loop, it has to have the semicolon at the end, right? So if input.getKeyCode.right arrow, if that's called, if I am pressing the right arrow to move right. And so what this does is it looks and it's going to play my function of move right. Now, right now I don't have anything in move right, but it's going to play it. So to see if it's actually doing that, I'm going to go ahead and make a little print statement. So print, and I'm going to add my quotation marks, because remember in quotation marks it'll print exactly what it says. I'm going to say print move it right. It doesn't matter if I have any spacing in here because it's in my parentheses. That's okay. I'm going to add my semicolon because remember we always end in a semicolon. Press Command S. I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to attach this to my mushroom guy. And so on my mushroom guy, I've attached this. Oh, let me get rid of that real quick. Remove component. And now I've attached this. I've got an RB player. I don't have a rigid body called yet, but I've got speed equals 5, jump thrust equals that. So I'm going to go ahead and first off, I have a rigid body on my player, and I want to be using my mushroom guy as my player. So I'm going to quickly set that up since I'm back in here by clicking and dragging move guy until it sits in my RB player. And so what that does is it says I'm looking for the mushroom guy's rigid body. So as I press play and I go to console, and I press my right arrow. Oh, it's not working. Let's see why it's not working. It should be. So let's go back into our code and see what's wrong. So move it right. Let's see. Print, move right, void update, get key, right arrow. Why aren't you working? That's the real question. Oh, it is. Okay. I just wasn't pressing the arrow hard enough. So move it right's working right here. As you can see, it's get key. So as long as I'm holding that, it's going to keep printing it. And that's kind of a no-no. Just because I don't want it to be printing all the time. But the reason I have this on specifically is because as I pull this up, I have a rigid body on. And with my rigid body, I have I have gravity. And so if I don't continue to have an object move, think of like your physics class, right? If you throw a ball and you're not continuously moving with the ball, keeping it going forward, instead you just throw it, eventually gravity takes hold and it slows it down and it stops it, right? So on our get key, that's like if we kept throwing, and instead of throwing the ball, we just kept running with the ball for as long as a button was pressed, and then as soon as it stops, we lose some of that momentum and everything else. So instead what we're doing is right now we're saying this move right. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to finish out these if statements before we come in here and we actually do any movement or jumps. So an easy way to redo this is I'm going to just copy this whole thing. I'm going to press Command C, which is copy. Then I'm going to go down here. I'm going to press Command V, which is paste. So that's a V as in like vampire. So in here, I'm going to do input.getKey key code. I'm going to change this from right arrow to left arrow, right? So this is my left. I'm going to say move left. Once again, make sure these match. They have to match. If I'm not sure what I'm doing and I want to make sure that I remember what this is later, I can always, add in a comment the same way these are commented. // moving, or when pressing left arrow, move left. And then I could simply, add another one for up here that says when pressing right arrow, move right. It's not, these are things to where it can help you remember how to do this later. And so the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add one last if statement before we kind of move on. And I'm going to go ahead and add my jump. So if, and this one's a little bit different, I'm going to do input, because remember we're getting that input key, and I'm going to do get key, and I'm going to do get key down. And so what get key down is as soon as I press it down, it's only for that instance of which I press, I want this to happen. I do not want it to happen the whole time I've had the button down, only the exact moment I press it down. And there's a reason for this, because if my character, if I am, adding velocity or I'm moving it, I do not want it to continue to move the whole time I'm pressing down the button. I want it to be, like when I throw a ball. Remember, on get key, it's like I'm holding the ball and I'm running with it and then, still going. Whereas if I get key down, it's like I tossed that ball as hard as I could. And then from there, gravity's going to take hold. So I'm going to put get key code dot space. Remember, we need to add in our curly brackets at the end here. And I'm going to do jump up. Remember, parentheses and semicolon, because this isn't an if statement, or a loop, or a function. It's just a statement. So right here, this now says I'm going to, move right, move left, or jump up. And these keys right here tell it what to do. And so now we're actually going to get into the nitty-gritty of how to make this happen. And as before, on my, give it a second, on my mushroom, I've already attached my rigid body. If you haven't done that yet, remember that you need to have that rigid body on there. Click, move it all the way over, and put it in RB player, or whatever you've named it. So as I come back into here, and give it a second. As I come back in here, now I'm going to be, adding in how to do a move right or a move left. So at the top, I have speed. And so speed is having to do with my movement. So to do this, I'm going to do RB player dot velocity. So if you remember anything about velocity from, school, it's that movement, right? It's the velocity of how you're moving. You're not accelerating necessarily. Remember, acceleration is how, keep going. Velocity is at that constant rate of what are you doing. And so we're doing RB.velocity because we want that movement. So RB.velocity equals, so we're going to set up what that velocity is. And so this is where you just kind of have to learn it. It's a little different, but we're going to do new vector 2. And the reason I want you to think of vector 2 is it's a 2D object, and think of Unity as being one big giant graph, right? It's got a graph complexion over here. You can see the lines and the grid. So X and Y are my vectors. So vector 2, and as I retype this, I'll retype it for you. Vector 2, you can see over here, it'll tell me that I need to add in some X and Y values. So X is always going to be that first value, and Y is always going to be your second. And so when I come in here, I want my X value because I'm moving right and left, which is my X, right? Across a grid is right and left. And and Y is up and down. So over here, I want it to move right, so I want it to move in the positive direction of my graph, or the fake graph that Unity has. So I'm going to put speed, and I'm going to do, and as you see here, it says float, whatever. And I'm going to do right, and I'm going to do, this is RB player dot velocity dot Y. And so what this does is it says, I want my speed or my velocity to be equal to that of speed, which I've set to 5, or whatever I set it to in my inspector. And then I want my Y to remain the same. And the reason I don't set my Y to 0 is if my character is jumping and I stop and I want to, stop moving, or, I want it to move, I don't want it to automatically just, stop moving, set that back, or stop jumping, stop falling, set it back to 0, and then have it set there. No, that's not what we want. We want it to actually continue going up and down freely as the player is already doing, right? So my RB player velocity equals Y, or dot Y, which just says it stays the same. So now to move left, I'm just going to copy this whole statement right here. I'm going to press Command C once again. I'm going to go down to my move left, and I'm going to press Command V. So that's, once again, V as in vampire. And here, I'm just going to do one thing. I'm going to change my speed to negative speed. And so what that does is it says -5. Now, I know this is a little tricky and whatnot, but now we want it to travel in the negative graph direction. We can't really go negative speed, but that is how it works in Unity. So I'm going to press Command S again. I'm going to come back in here. I'm going to press play, and we should see our character moving. Now, we have a little bit of a problem because our character, instead of just stopping, kind of just keeps going, kind of like an ice skating feel. As I let up on the button, it just kind of slows itself down, and that's not really what I want. I want it to be more like a Super Mario type thing, where it stops as soon as my button lets up. So before I even get into my jump, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add some spaces in here once I've closed those if statements right. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say, okay, I want it to stop as soon as I let up on that key. So I'm going to make another if statement. And in here I'm going to do that input dot get key. And here I'm going to say get key up, which means when I let up on that key, I want something to happen. So I'm going to do get key up, key code, dot left arrow, and I can just click that and press enter. And I'm going to go and I'm going to use these double straight lines, and you may be like, where the heck is that on my keys? It's actually in between your enter and your, backspace or delete button right here. And so you're going to add 2 of those, and what that says right here, and this is just coding language, is this reads as an OR. So instead of, if input.getKeyUp key code left arrow, and this reads as or, so I'm just going to copy this. Once again, it makes my life easier. If you need to completely write it out again, I understand. But then I'm going to put my or, and then I'm going to say get key code, get key up key code. I'm going to change this to right arrow. And so now what this says, I need to add my curly brackets. That's bad of me. But what this says is get key code up, key code left arrow, or get key up, key code right arrow. So on the left arrow and the right arrow, if either of those, are let up on, this is going to happen. And so right here, we're just going to come back to our rb.player.velocity equals, and I'm just typing this real fast, and then we'll go through what it means. New vector 2, let's see, 0, rb player dot velocity dot y. And so what this says is suddenly my character doesn't have any velocity at all. It stops, right? We're not dealing with where are they on the grid. We're dealing with how fast are they traveling. So as soon as I let up on either my left or my right arrow key, my X value, like my left or right as my character is moving, suddenly just stops. That's how I want it, because that really keeps it going the way it needs to go, right? It stops it as soon as I want it to stop. So I come back in here and press play, wait for it, and then as you can see now, my character automatically stops when I stop pressing the button. So that's good. That's how I want it to be. Now we're going to do one last thing. I'm going to come back in here, and you can freeze this at any time. Look over the code. Once again, in my void update, I have my right arrow pressed. I'm going to go to my move right function, my left arrow pressed, go to my move left function. I've got my nice little if statement here that says stop moving right or left. I just added a little comment for myself. And then I've got this down here, which is my jump when space arrow is pressed. So this is my jump. So the last thing I need to code is this jump. So my jump up. So in my jump up, I'm going to add something a little bit different than, a player velocity. And so with the player velocity, it's more about keeping it at the same speed. Whereas with my jump up, I want it to be like you actually jumping. So you only have, as we said before, it's get key down. So you only have that instance to jump. And instead of, having a flat velocity, this really has to do with adding, a little bit of force behind it. Like I said before, like throwing a ball or like jumping up, you only have so much force you can exert. So to do that, I'm going to do rb.player.add force. And then I'm going to add my brackets in here. I'm going to do new vector 2, once again, like I said, this is something we just have to learn. It's just kind of, the way it is. And I'm going to put 0 because we're not working on the x-axis. And now you might be going, whoa, 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 you're turning your velocity to 0. No, no, no. This says I don't want to add force there. I just want my force to remain 0. I don't want it to go haywire to one side. So I want my force at 0 for that. And I'm going to put a comma, and now I'm going to do my float y. And so to do that, I have my jump thrust up here, remember, and that's set to 350F. So right down here, I'm just going to put in jump thrust. I'm going to add a comma, or not a comma, a semicolon at the end. And so what this does is it says I want to add the force of jump thrust, however high that force is, in the x value. So I want it to go up, right? And don't worry, 0 is fine. It's not, negating my velocity. It's just saying I don't want to add any force that way. So I'm going to press Command S. And now as I come back in here, I move left, right, and I can jump. Okay, now I realize that I may not have said this. Command S is just the shortcut to save. So you always want to make sure you save your script. And always, always, always make sure you are out of play mode before editing your script. The reason is sometimes if you're editing and you save it it goes wonky and it will kind of crash Unity sometimes. So always make sure that you've unpressed play whenever you're editing your script. You save it whenever you've edited, and if you aren't sure if you have saved it, up at the top right now it's an X because I have. If I go ahead and I do anything, it turns it to this little O or 0. And so what that means is I haven't saved yet. So if I press Command S, or if you're on a PC, Control S, it will save. So that is how we move. I know it's a little long, it's a little tedious. You can go back over this video as many times as you want. It's okay. There are many ways to make movement. This is the easiest for a side view, a side scroller. This is going to be your easiest way to create movement. I will talk to you guys later. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in class.